Hello, dear children. Welcome to our English class. George's Secret Key to the Universe. Let's continue the story. George's Secret Key to the Universe. Now, George was completed his oath. Eric and Annie shows their happiness. Eric became very proud. He said, "Well done. Cosmo will now show us how a star is born." Now they are ready for watching the star formation. Cosmo welcomed George. Welcome to the universe. The room was getting darker and darker. "Come and sit here, George," called Annie, who had already settled herself on a big comfy sofa. George sat down next to her, and after a few seconds, he saw a tiny beam of very bright white light. It came directly from the Cosmos screen. The beam shot out into the middle of the room, where it wavered for a second before it began to sketch a shape in the air. Now, George, Eric, and Annie are ready for watching the star formation. They sit together and they saw a tiny beam light shot out in the middle of the room. George became surprised and he broke the silence and spoke first. He says, "But that looked like a." When George began to speak, Eric replied, "A window." George added, "Cosmo has made us a window on the universe." The beam of the light disappeared, leaving the window it had drawn in the middle of the Eric's sitting room hanging in mid-air. It now looked exactly like a real window. It had a big sheet of glass in the pane and metal frame. Beyond it there was a view, and that view was not of Eric's house, or of any house, road, or town, or anywhere else that George had ever seen before. Now George can see a real light window it had hanging in the middle of the room. Instead, through the window, George could see an incredible vast darkness peppered with what looked like tiny bright stars. He started to try and count them. George tried to count the stars. When he started to counting, Cosmos added in his mechanical voice, "There are billions and billions of stars in the universe." Cosmos explained the origin of stars and its existence. Cosmos also starts to answer all the questions asked by George. "How long does it take for a star to be born?" George asked to Cosmo. He replied, "Tens of millions of years." "Tut tut," said Eric, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the sofa. "Don't worry, George. I have speeded it up quite a lot. You will still get home for dinner." George noticed something about the view through the window onto a outer space. Not all of it was covered with a little star. In the bottom corner of the window he saw a patches of total darkness, a place where not a single star born. Then his sight gets attracted to a space on the window where is utter darkness. That means complete darkness. He asks again what happening there. "Let's have a look, shall we?" said Eric. He pressed a button on the remote control and the view through the window seemed to zoom towards a dark patch. As they got closer, George realized that an enormous cloud was hovering in that spot. The window kept moving forward until they were right inside the cloud itself, and George could see it was made of gas and dust just as Cosmo had said. When George asked what was happening there, Eric replied, "Just have a look," and then he pressed the button and zoom that part and make it closer to them. Now he can realize that an enormous cloud was hovering in that spot. Hovering means staying in the same position in the air without moving towards or backward. Now George can see it was made up of gas and dust, just like Cosmo had already said. It is a huge cloud in outer space, much bigger than the ones in the sky, replied Eric, made up of tiny particles which are all floating around inside it. There are so many of the particles that the cloud is enormous. It's so big that you could put millions and millions of Earths inside it. From this cloud, many stars will be born. For George's doubt, Eric explained what was happening there. Uh, this was this was a huge cloud that was made up of tiny particles which were are floating around inside it. There are so many of the particles that the cloud is enormous. It's so big, and you could put millions and millions of Earths inside it. Inside the cloud, George could see particles moving around, some joining together to form huge lumps of matter. These great lumps spun around and round, gathering even more particles all the time. But as the particles joined together, the spinning lumps were getting bigger. Instead, they seemed to be getting smaller, as though something was causing them. It's looked like someone was making gigantic duff balls in outer space. One of these giant balls was quite close to the window. Now the George could see it spinning around, getting smaller and smaller all the time. As it shrank, it became hotter and hotter. So hot that George could feel the heat from where he sat on the sofa. And then it started to glow with a dim but frightening light. George again asked why it is glowing. George replied, the more it shrinks, the hotter it gets. The hotter it gets, the brighter it shines. Very soon it's going to get too hot. The ball exploded from the inside, throwing off its outer layers of burning hot gas in all directions. After the explosion, the ball was shining like the sun. George was exclaimed. He asked, is that a sun? Eric replied, that's how stars are born, and the sun is a star. When a huge amount of gas and dust combines and shrinks to become dense and hot, as you have just seen, the particles in the middle of the ball are pressed together, they start to fuse or join up, releasing an enormous amount of energy. This is called nuclear fusion reaction. It is so powerful that when it starts, it shows a layer of the ball, and the rest it transforms into a star. That's what you just saw. The star was now shining steadily in the distance. It was a beautiful sight. George gazed at it, amazed by its power. Every now and then he could see huge jets of brightly shining gases sent hundreds of thousands of miles from the surface at extraordinary speeds.